Two armies walked into the same jungle, but only one vanished into it. Vietnam, 1966. The wet season has turned Phuoc Tuy province into a steam bath. The canopy above is so thick that noon feels like dusk. Every sound carries differently here. Some amplified, some swallowed whole by the vegetation. An Australian patrol moves through the bamboo. 4 men. Bush hats pulled low. Their silhouettes blur into the greens and browns around them. They step carefully, deliberately, reading the jungle like a language they've studied for years. You can hear the insects, the distant birds, the rustle of leaves and what passes for wind down here. But the Australians? They're ghosts. 3 kilometers away, an American patrol pushes through the same terrain. Helmets catch the filtered light. Metal clips and buckles create a rhythm of small sounds, taps, clinks, the brush of equipment against more equipment. They move with purpose, with confidence, with the weight of the most powerful military on Earth behind them. But in this jungle, they're visible, audible, present. The question isn't which approach was braver. Both forces fought with extraordinary courage in Vietnam. The question is simpler and stranger. Why did 2 allied armies, fighting the same enemy in the same jungle, look so completely different? The answer starts with a hat. The Australian bush hat wasn't a fashion statement. It wasn't rebellion against military tradition or some laid-back Aussie approach to warfare. It was survival equipment, refined over decades of jungle fighting, adapted specifically for the kind of war Vietnam demanded. Let's start with what it actually did. The wide brim broke up the human silhouette. In dense vegetation, the human head is one of the most recognizable shapes in nature, that round dome on top of shoulders. Enemy fighters learned to spot it. A helmet, with its smooth curves and hard edges, made that silhouette even more obvious. The bush hat? It disrupted the shape entirely. The irregular brim, the way it sat at different angles, the shadows it cast, all of it made the wearer harder to identify as human from a distance. It stopped glare. Helmets, particularly the American M1 with its smooth steel surface, could catch light. Not often, not dramatically. But in a jungle where survival sometimes came down to not being seen for just a few more seconds, even the slightest reflection was a liability. The fabric of the bush hat absorbed light instead of bouncing it back. It kept sweat manageable. This sounds minor until you've spent 12 hours in 100-degree heat with 90% humidity. Sweat running into your eyes doesn't just sting. It blinds you at the exact moment you need to see. The bush hat's brim channeled sweat away from the face. Soldiers could tie a piece of cloth around the inside band to soak up moisture. Small thing. Massive difference. But here's what older Australian veterans talk about most. The bush hat helped them sense the jungle better. A helmet creates a barrier. It sits tight against your skull, muffles certain sounds, changes how you perceive direction. In the jungle, where you often heard danger before you saw it, this was critical. The bush hat sat loose. It let air circulate. More importantly, it didn't interfere with your hearing. You could track sound better, the direction of voices, the crack of a branch, the subtle change in bird calls that meant someone else was moving nearby. And then, there's the noise issue. A helmet was essentially a bell strapped to your head. Tap it against a low branch, noise. Brush it against bamboo, noise. Have rain hit it during a monsoon patrol, constant drumming that broadcasts your position. The vegetation in Vietnamese jungles was dense, low, grabbing. You couldn't move through it without contact. A fabric hat made almost no sound when it touched foliage. A metal helmet announced your presence with every step. The Australians understood something fundamental. In this jungle, being invisible was often more valuable than being protected. The bush hat was the physical embodiment of that philosophy. To understand why the Australians wore bush hats while Americans wore helmets, you have to understand that these 2 armies were fighting different kinds of wars in the same place. The Australian approach, particularly for their SAS and infantry patrols, centered on stealth. Small teams, often just 4 to 6 men, would move deep into enemy territory for days at a time. Their job wasn't to dominate ground or hold positions. It was to gather intelligence, identify enemy movements, and engage only when absolutely necessary, or when they held overwhelming advantage. This required a specific kind of fieldcraft. Every piece of equipment was chosen for how little noise it made, how little it weighed, how well it helped you blend in. Australians stripped their gear down obsessively. If something wasn't essential, it didn't come on patrol. The bush hat fit perfectly into this philosophy. Maximum function, minimum profile. They moved slowly, painfully slowly sometimes. A 4-hour patrol might cover less than a kilometer if the situation demanded it. They stopped constantly to listen, to observe, to let the jungle settle back into its normal rhythm after they passed through. The goal was to see without being seen, to hear without being heard. American doctrine was different, shaped by different experiences and different strategic goals. The U.S. military had built its reputation on firepower and decisive engagement. In World War II and Korea, success came from bringing overwhelming force to bear on the enemy. Superior equipment, superior logistics, superior air support. These were the pillars of American military dominance. That approach required different gear and different tactics. American soldiers carried more equipment, much more. The average American infantryman in Vietnam humped 60 to 80 pounds of gear. Ammunition, rations, water, radio equipment, grenades, medical supplies. The helmet was part of a system designed around the assumption that when contact came, you needed to be ready to fight immediately and aggressively. Their movement doctrine reflected this. American patrols often moved in larger units, squads, platoons, sometimes company-sized elements. They patrolled with the expectation of contact, ready to call in artillery or air support the moment things went loud. The emphasis was on firepower and survivability once the shooting started, not on avoiding the shooting in the first place. Neither approach was wrong. They were solving different problems. But in the jungle, the differences became stark. Watch an American patrol move through dense vegetation, and you'd see the helmet constantly catching on vines, snagging on, wait a minute, thorns, forcing the wearer to duck lower or move wider to avoid branches. Each interaction created noise. The scrape of metal on wood, the snap of vegetation, the rustle of leaves. The helmet's chin strap was another issue. Most soldiers wore it loose or didn't fasten it at all, because a tight strap was uncomfortable and could even be dangerous if the concussion from an explosion caught the helmet and snapped your neck. But a loose strap meant the helmet shifted and moved, creating its own rhythm of small sounds. Then there was the weight. The M1 steel helmet weighed about 3 pounds. That doesn't sound like much until you're wearing it in 100-degree heat for 12 hours. Neck fatigue became a real problem. Soldiers would naturally shift their posture to compensate, which affected their movement, their ability to move quietly, their overall effectiveness on long patrols. The Australian bush hat weighed a few ounces. More critically, the hat changed how soldiers interacted with their environment. With a helmet, you had to be conscious of it constantly, ducking branches, avoiding snags, trying to minimize the noise it made. With a bush hat, you could focus entirely on the environment around you. Your head could move naturally. You could tilt your head to listen without metal shifting. You could brush against foliage without announcing your position. Australian veterans talk about being able to feel the jungle through the bush hat, the way the brim would catch on spider webs before you walked into them, how the pressure on the hat would tell you a branch was coming before you saw it. Small things. Survival things. The jungle in Vietnam wasn't just dangerous, it was deceptive. Sound traveled strangely there. The humidity, the density of vegetation, the irregular terrain, all of it created acoustic dead zones and amplification pockets. A whisper might carry 50 meters in one direction and be inaudible at 10 meters in another. Experienced soldiers learned to read these patterns, to use sound as both weapon and warning system. The jungle had its own rhythm. Insects created a constant backdrop of noise. Clicks, buzzes, chirps. Birds called out territory and alarm. Monkeys crashed through the canopy. When you'd been out there long enough, you learned what normal sounded like. More importantly, you learned to recognize when normal changed. Birds going quiet, insects stopping mid-chorus. The sudden absence of sound was often the first warning that something was wrong, that someone else was moving nearby, that danger was close. This is where the bush hat became critical. Australian soldiers learned to listen with their entire body. They'd freeze mid-step at the slightest change in the soundscape, trying to identify what shifted and where it came from. The bush hat didn't interfere with this process. If anything, it enhanced it. The brim helped shield their ears from direct overhead noise, letting them focus on sounds coming from the horizontal plane where threats actually existed. American soldiers had to fight their equipment to do the same thing. A helmet muffled sound, not dramatically, but enough to make directional hearing harder. Was that noise ahead of you, or to the left? The helmet's steel shell created a barrier that sound had to travel around. Veterans described it as listening through a bucket. You could hear, but the clarity and directionality were compromised. Then there was the noise the helmet itself made. Rain was the worst. During the monsoon season, rain fell hard and constant. On a bush hat, rain created a soft patter that actually helped mask other sounds. On a helmet? It was like someone drumming on a metal pot right above your head. It made communication difficult, made listening for danger nearly impossible, and broadcast your position to anyone within 100 meters. Even in light rain or heavy humidity, condensation would form on the inside of the helmet, dripping down at random intervals. Every drop that hit the helmet's surface made a small ping. Multiply that by an entire patrol of helmeted soldiers, and you had a mobile percussion section moving through the jungle. Australian patrols could move in near silence. American patrols always made some noise. The Australians used this to their advantage. They'd set up listening posts, just 2 or 3 men with a radio, sitting perfectly still for hours, sometimes days, just listening. The jungle would settle around them. The normal sounds would resume. And then, when enemy forces moved through the area, they'd hear them coming long before they saw them. The bush hat was essential for this kind of work. You couldn't do it with a helmet constantly reminding you it was there, constantly pulling your attention back to your own discomfort. There's a story that made the rounds among Australian units. An SAS patrol had set up an ambush along a known enemy trail. They'd been in position for 18 hours, not moving, barely breathing. When the enemy patrol finally came through, the Australians were so still, so silent, so perfectly blended with their surroundings, that the enemy walked within 2 meters of their position without noticing. The bush hats helped achieve that invisibility. Helmets never could have. American soldiers knew this. They saw how effectively the Australians operated, how they seemed to read the jungle in ways that felt almost supernatural. But they were locked into a different system, with different priorities and different constraints. Understanding the bush hat requires understanding the specific terrain where Australians fought in Vietnam. Phuoc Tuy province wasn't uniform jungle. It was a patchwork of different environments, each presenting its own challenges. There were rubber plantations, rows of trees that looked organized from a distance but created a maze of shadows and sightlines up close. The undergrowth between the trees grew thick and tangled. Moving through a rubber plantation meant dealing with vines at face level, roots that caught your feet, and the constant awareness that enemy soldiers could be 20 meters away and completely invisible. There were coastal areas with different vegetation entirely. Mangroves, salt marshes, dense scrub that tore at your uniform and skin. The ground was often wet, sometimes flooded. The smell of decay was constant. In these areas, the bush hat's water resistance mattered. The fabric could get soaked and still maintain its shape, still function. A helmet filled with water became heavier, more uncomfortable, more of a liability. There were the long high hills, steep, rocky terrain covered in dense jungle. Moving through hills meant constant changes in elevation, scrambling over rocks, pushing through vegetation that grew even thicker where sunlight managed to penetrate the canopy. The bush hat moved with you through all of this. It bent when you needed to duck under a branch, straightened when you stood. The helmet was rigid, unforgiving, constantly catching on obstacles. And then there were the rice paddies and open areas where both Australian and American forces had to operate. Here, the differences became less pronounced. Open terrain favored neither the bush hat nor the helmet specifically. But even here, Australian soldiers noticed advantages. The hat's brim provided better sun protection during long days, better rain protection during monsoons, and better cooling when even slight air movement could make a difference. The Australian base at Nui Dat sat in the middle of this varied terrain. Patrols going out in different directions faced different challenges, but the bush hat proved adaptable to all of them. It was simple enough to work everywhere, specialized enough to excel in the conditions where Australians spent most of their time: dense vegetation, close quarters, situations where stealth mattered more than armor. Veterans remember specific places where the bush hat made the difference. The bamboo thickets that grew so dense you had to push through them sideways. The wait-a-minute vines that covered entire sections of trail, their thorns grabbing at anything they touched. The stream crossings where you had to wade through chest-deep water, then immediately move back into dense brush on the other side. The bush hat handled all of it, without complaint, without adding to the already considerable burden of jungle warfare. The Australian military's willingness to adapt wasn't new in Vietnam. It was part of a longer tradition of soldiers in the field making practical decisions based on real conditions. In North Africa during World War II, Australian soldiers modified their uniforms and equipment constantly. They learned from the British what worked in desert warfare, then adapted those lessons to their own needs. They traded with other units, improvised solutions, made do with what was available. The brass generally allowed this, as long as soldiers remained effective. In the jungles of New Guinea, facing Japanese forces in some of the most brutal terrain of the Pacific War, Australians again proved willing to abandon equipment that didn't work and embrace what did. They learned to move through jungle that most armies considered impassable. They developed tactics for ambush and patrol that would later influence their approach in Vietnam. And yes, they wore bush hats throughout, hats that had proven themselves in Australian conditions for decades. By the time Australian forces arrived in Vietnam, this tradition of practical adaptation was deeply ingrained. Officers who'd served in earlier conflicts understood that the soldier on patrol often knew better than the planners back at base what gear worked in specific conditions. There was an implicit trust. You train soldiers thoroughly, you give them quality equipment, and then you trust their judgment in the field. This created a feedback loop. Soldiers would identify problems with equipment or tactics. They'd discuss solutions with their mates, with their sergeants, with their officers. Good ideas moved up the chain quickly. Bad equipment got replaced or modified. The system was flexible enough to respond to reality. The bush hat benefited from this culture. No one needed to make a formal case for it. It had proven itself in previous conflicts. It made sense for the current conditions, and soldiers wanted to wear it. That was enough. This contrasted sharply with the American system, where innovation and adaptation faced more institutional resistance. American units did adapt extensively, in fact. Soldiers learned jungle warfare, developed new tactics, modified their approach constantly. But equipment changes required approval from higher up the chain, needed to be tested and standardized, had to work for the entire massive American force in Vietnam. The difference wasn't that Americans were inflexible, or that Australians were casual about military standards. The difference was scale and institutional culture. The Australian force in Vietnam numbered around 8,000 at its peak. The American force numbered over 500,000 at its height. Standardizing equipment and tactics for that many soldiers spread across the entire country created different imperatives and different constraints. The Australian bush hat, officially called the slouch hat, carried more than a century of military tradition by the time soldiers wore it in Vietnam. It had been adopted in the 1880s by colonial Australian forces. The design was influenced by practical headgear that settlers and bushmen wore in the Australian outback. Wide-brimmed, ventilated, designed for harsh sun and difficult conditions. When Australian military forces formalized their uniforms, the hat came with them. At Gallipoli in 1915, Australian soldiers wore slouch hats as they landed on the beaches and fought their way up the cliffs. The hat became associated with the Anzac legend, with courage under impossible circumstances, with soldiers who improvised and adapted, with a distinctly Australian approach to warfare that emphasized individual initiative and mateship. Through World War I, the hat remained standard issue. Australian soldiers wore it in the trenches of the Western Front, though they often switched to steel helmets during actual combat. The slouch hat was their identity, their connection to home, the symbol of who they were. In World War II, it went everywhere Australian forces went. In the North African desert, soldiers pinned up one side of the brim to keep their rifles from catching it, a modification that became part of the hat's iconic appearance. In the jungles of New Guinea and Borneo, it proved its worth in conditions similar to what soldiers would later face in Vietnam. This history mattered. When Australian soldiers put on the bush hat in Vietnam, they were connecting themselves to every Australian soldier who'd worn it before. They were carrying forward a tradition, maintaining a link to the past. The hat represented continuity, the idea that Australian soldiers in 1966 were cut from the same cloth as those who'd fought at Gallipoli, in North Africa, in the Pacific. American soldiers had their own deep traditions, their own symbols of military identity. But the M1 helmet, while iconic, was associated with a different kind of warfare. World War II beachheads, Korean winters, conventional battles with clear front lines. It hadn't been tested in extended jungle warfare before Vietnam. The American military was learning in real time how to adapt their equipment and tactics to this new environment. The Australians came to Vietnam with equipment and tactics already proven in similar conditions. They weren't starting from scratch. They were applying hard-won lessons from New Guinea, Malaya, and Borneo. The bush hat was part of that accumulated knowledge, a tool that had been refined through multiple conflicts in tropical environments. The British had been fighting communist insurgents in Malaya for years, before Australia or America became heavily involved in Vietnam. Australian forces deployed to Malaya during that conflict, learning jungle warfare from experienced British officers and from the environment itself. In Malaya, the lessons were clear. Heavy equipment slowed you down, noise got you killed, and blending into the jungle was essential. British forces adapted their tactics accordingly. They formed small patrol units, emphasized stealth and intelligence gathering, and learned to live in the jungle for extended periods. Australian soldiers absorbed these lessons. When they rotated through Malaya, they saw what worked and what didn't. They saw that soldiers who moved quietly and patiently were more effective than those who tried to dominate terrain through firepower alone. They saw that the jungle rewarded adaptation and punished rigidity. Many of the Australian officers and NCOS who served in Vietnam had combat experience from Malaya. They brought those lessons with them, along with the equipment and tactics that had proven effective. The bush hat was part of that package. It had worked in Malaya. It would work in Vietnam. This experience created a knowledge gap between Australian and American forces. Americans were developing their understanding of jungle warfare through trial and error in Vietnam itself. They were adapting quickly. American soldiers were nothing if not adaptable, but they were still learning lessons that Australians already knew. American advisors who worked with Australian units consistently noted this difference. The Australians seemed comfortable in the jungle in a way that took American soldiers months to develop. They moved differently, sounded different, approached patrols differently. Some of this was training and experience. Some of it was equipment. The bush hat was a visible symbol of that accumulated expertise. None of this analysis should suggest that the bush hat made Australian soldiers invincible, or that American soldiers were at a disadvantage because of their helmets. Combat in Vietnam was brutal and unpredictable for everyone involved. When firefights erupted, the protective value of the helmet became immediately apparent. Shrapnel from grenades, mortars, and artillery killed and wounded thousands of soldiers on all sides. A helmet could deflect or slow fragments that would otherwise have caused fatal head wounds. American soldiers whose lives were saved by their helmets had every reason to value them. Australian soldiers understood this trade-off. They knew the bush hat provided no ballistic protection. They accepted that risk in exchange for the tactical advantages the hat provided. It was a calculated decision based on how they fought. Lots of time on patrol moving quietly, less time in sustained firefights, emphasis on avoiding detection and engaging on their terms. When Australian units did get into heavy combat, the lack of helmet protection showed. At the Battle of Long Tan in August 1966, Australian soldiers fought a desperate action against a much larger enemy force. They were caught in the open during a rubber plantation, engaged in exactly the kind of sustained firefight where helmets provided real protection. Casualties were significant. Some soldiers were wounded by shrapnel that a helmet might have stopped. But even in that desperate battle, the Australian approach to fighting, small unit tactics, fire discipline, using terrain effectively, helped them survive until reinforcements arrived. The bush hat hadn't caused the battle to happen, and helmets wouldn't have prevented it. The tactical situation was what it was, regardless of headgear. The reality was that both the bush hat and the helmet represented different calculations about risk. The helmet protected against certain dangers, fragments, debris, impacts. The bush hat helped avoid different dangers, detection, ambush, the cumulative fatigue of carrying extra weight, and brutal heat. Neither choice eliminated risk. Combat was dangerous regardless of what you wore on your head. But in the specific conditions where Australian forces operated, fighting the way they fought, the bush hat made tactical sense most of the time. Despite the differences in equipment and tactics, Australian and American soldiers developed deep mutual respect during their time in Vietnam. Americans admired Australian fieldcraft. They watched Australian patrols prepare for operations and saw the attention to detail, the careful preparation, the obsessive focus on noise discipline. They saw how Australian soldiers moved through the jungle and recognized skill when they saw it. Australian soldiers respected American courage and firepower. When things went bad, when Australian units were in trouble, American artillery and air support could be the difference between survival and disaster. The Americans' ability to bring overwhelming force to bear, to call in helicopters and jets and artillery within minutes, was extraordinary. The two forces worked together regularly. They shared intelligence, coordinated operations, learned from each other. American soldiers would sometimes accompany Australian patrols as observers, learning techniques they could bring back to their own units. Australian soldiers benefited from American logistics, medical support, and firepower. The bush hat became a symbol of this relationship. American soldiers would trade for them, wear them in base camps when regulations allowed, keep them as souvenirs. The hat represented something they respected about the Australians: that ability to blend into the jungle, to move quietly, to fight on their own terms. For Australians, wearing the bush hat among American soldiers was sometimes a point of pride. It marked them as different, as specialists in jungle warfare, as soldiers with their own traditions and their own proven methods. But it was pride without arrogance. They knew the Americans were fighting the same enemy, facing the same dangers, showing the same courage. The equipment differences never created friction between the forces. If anything, the diversity of approaches was seen as an advantage. Australian patrols could scout ahead, gather intelligence, identify enemy positions. American forces could then bring their superior firepower to bear. The two approaches complemented each other. After Vietnam, both the Australian and American militaries spent years analyzing what worked and what didn't. The lessons learned influenced military thinking for decades. For Australia, Vietnam validated many of their existing approaches. The emphasis on small unit tactics, stealth, and jungle fieldcraft proved effective. The equipment they'd chosen, including the bush hat, had served them well. Future Australian military operations continued to emphasize these principles. The bush hat itself remained standard issue for Australian forces. It's still worn today in appropriate environments, still recognized worldwide as distinctly Australian military headgear. The tradition continues. Soldiers still shape their hats individually, still wear them with pride, still connect themselves to that long history of Australian military service. For America, Vietnam prompted extensive re-evaluation of jungle warfare doctrine. The military studied what had worked, what hadn't, and how to better prepare soldiers for similar environments in the future. Some of these lessons involved recognizing that different environments required different equipment and different tactics, exactly what the Australians had understood from the beginning. Modern American forces are much more flexible about equipment in the field. Special operations units in particular are given significant latitude to choose gear appropriate for their specific missions. The rigid standardization that characterized much of the Vietnam era has given way to a more adaptive approach. The helmet itself evolved. Modern combat helmets are lighter, better ventilated, less prone to the problems that plagued the M1 in the jungle. They still provide protection, but they're designed with more awareness of the conditions where soldiers actually fight. In the end, the difference between the bush hat and the helmet reflected a fundamental difference in how two Allied armies understood the same war. The Australians treated the jungle as the primary opponent. They studied it, adapted to it, learned to move through it as if they belonged there. The enemy was dangerous, absolutely, but the jungle itself was the constant challenge, the thing that would kill you if you didn't respect it. Their gear reflected this priority: lightweight, quiet, designed for stealth and endurance. The Americans treated the enemy as the primary opponent. The jungle was terrain to move through, an obstacle to overcome, but not the central problem. The enemy was the problem, and when you found them, you needed to be ready to bring overwhelming firepower to bear. Their gear reflected this priority: protective, combat-ready, designed for survivability in direct engagement. Neither approach was wrong in absolute terms. They were optimized for different scenarios, different tactical assumptions, different strategic goals. But in the thick jungle of Phuoc Tuy province, in the rubber plantations around Nui Dat, in the dense vegetation of the long high hills, the Australian approach proved extraordinarily effective. Their casualty rates were lower than expected. Their intelligence gathering was exceptional. Their ability to control territory with relatively small numbers was remarkable. The bush hat was a small part of that success, but it was an important part. It represented a philosophy that, in certain environments, being invisible was better than being invincible. That moving quietly was worth more than moving heavily armed. That understanding the terrain was as important as understanding the enemy. American soldiers respected this. Many wished they could operate the same way, but they were part of a different machine, with different imperatives and different constraints. The bush hat wasn't what made Australian soldiers effective in Vietnam. Their training did that. Their fieldcraft did that. Their courage and professionalism did that. But the bush hat was the perfect tool for how they fought. For the small patrols, the long-range reconnaissance, the patient observation, the sudden violence when it was needed, and the careful invisibility when it wasn't. The Americans brought the best equipment in the world to Vietnam, the most advanced helicopters, the most powerful artillery, the most sophisticated logistics network ever deployed. They brought body armor and reliable radios and air support that could arrive in minutes. The Australians brought gear that was right for the jungle. In the dense vegetation of Vietnam, where sound carried strangely and visibility measured in meters, where the jungle itself seemed to be paying attention, that difference mattered. The bush hat didn't make the Australian soldier, but it became part of what the Australian soldier was: practical, adaptable, quietly professional, shaped by experience and tradition in equal measure. And in that jungle, for that war, it was exactly what they needed.